Welcome to Beneath My Rib, trail mix for your spiritual journey. Your hostess is Kathleen Ann Thompson, international missionary, teacher and lecturer, and artistic director of Bellhurst Productions. Kathleen, American-born, was educated in the U.S. as well as in Europe, but has worked ecumenically the last 25 years in Europe, Eastern Europe, and Russia, as well as China, South Africa, and South America. We hope that wherever you find yourself on your spiritual journey, Beneath My Rib will offer you some spiritual nuggets to sustain you on your way. Remember that though your journey may be long, it is never alone. And now, Kathleen.
Greetings, everybody. It's nice to be with you again, even if it is only virtually. Today we're going to explore in this podcast the reconciliation between man's need for sovereignty and his abhorrence to uncertainty. You know, as we all live through this period of lockdown, we're experiencing many unpleasant psychological soul states. None of these emotional conditions has affected us in such a widespread negativity in our lives as that state of uncertainty. We have an abhorrence to it and what it creates. Like a cat tied up in a mountain of loose yarn, we're struggling frantically to find a way out of it. A short examination of uncertainty will expose the evidence that we are definitely frustrated by not being able to plan, to organize, to think, to find vision into our future, to prepare for what's coming. We experience the fragility of being out of control and sense the presence of a huge predatory fear stalking us. Uncertainty erodes our confidence, our strength, productivity, sense of accomplishment, and our peace. Thus, we start to look around for a functionary of certainty that will take control for us. I'm reminded at this moment of my grandson, Justin, when he was only 4 years old and his mother was momentarily expected to go to the hospital and give birth to his little sister. And a neighbor came to the door. Justin answered the door alone, and she asked if his mother was already in the hospital. And Justin looked at her with the most forlorn, miserable, and despairing face and said, "No, she can't go to the hospital. She has to take care of me." And I think this is how we feel. I mean, it begins to beg the question for us. If we can't control everything, who or what is in control? Well, did God give governance, a controlling authority to man over everything? In Genesis 1:26, God says, "Let us make man in our image, after our likeness, and let him have, therefore, dominion over the fish of the sea, over the fowls of the air, over the cattle, over all the earth, and over all the creepers creeping on the earth," over all. It was a training program designed by God for self-governing for Adam and Eve. Man was given governance over all of God's creation. So then a hand shoots up in the classroom very fast and says, "Yes, teacher, but what happened to Adam and Eve's control over the creation?" Good question. It seems that man took his mandate in the beginning to govern in the garden with great enthusiasm and zeal. He named all the animals, took custody over the garden. But then we're told that the couple moved outside of God's rules. Henceforth, their governance was severely limited by the absolute sovereignty of the Lord. Free will. This opening story of the Bible presents for us one of the most illustrative pictures of the strange dichotomy housed in the creature God created called man. God created his prize creature with free will. In fact, it is his spiritual DNA hardwired into his identity. As a result, man has vision for a life he controls and decides for. He finds that certainty is a necessary state of existence in order to facilitate his vision. So, does man's God-given mandate of governance equip him also to build pillars of absolutism that are mandatory to secure that certainty? The answer is no, since the world that he lives in is sustained by its variability. This quality of God's supreme creation allows it to adapt, evolve, change with the constant incoming stimuli challenging its stability. Now, we have revealed an inherent tension in man, an antagonistic duality within him. On one side, man is hardwired to fulfill his mandate for governance and seek the realization of his independent will. But on the other side, he lacks the full sovereignty of his mandate to secure certainty and eliminate uncertainty, which is his foil. So what does a free-willed man who abhors uncertainty because it diminishes his effective self-governance do with an inability to create himself an absolute structure which guarantees his certainty? Well, we read it in Exodus as the newly freed people of God's nation of Israel experienced the fear of uncertainty when Moses, their leader, ascends the mountain to speak to God and then was not seen again for 30 days. Fear took control of their souls, and they started to cry out and demand of Aaron. Exodus 32:1, "Make us gods." Well, I guess they needed a sovereign. What is a sovereign? A sovereign has absolute control and power over a designated territory. It is a supreme rank with authority that is preeminent and indisputable, being above all others in character, importance, excellence, and virtue. Sovereignty requires an acceptance of absolutism. Uncertainty drives us to search for a sovereign who can guarantee certainty. Without a sovereign available to us, we will try to make our own, as did the Hebrews at the bottom of Mount Sinai when they melted down their gold to make an idol of Egypt. Today, we don't carve or sculpt idols of metal, wood, or stone, but shape idols of culture with powers of money, fame, sex, and governing privilege. We declare them as sovereign, and thus give power to those false sovereigns who we think are in agreement with our perspective of truth. The expectation is that our false sovereign will appropriate certainty for us according to our perspective of truth. That expectation neglects to consider that certainty requires pillars of absolutism, which would establish rigid and unchanging protocols of behavior in order to secure that certainty. Postmodern thought does not allow, though, for absolutism, but instead champions relativism, both rational and material. The contemporary consensus thinking does not recognize any universal standards of absolute truth, and therefore cannot impose foundational absolutisms to create certainty for anyone. However, it does seem that the God of creation, our Lord and Savior, makes an unashamed claim of sovereignty. Isaiah 45:7. I form light and create darkness. I make goodness and create disaster. I am the Lord who does all these things. Exodus 4:11. Then God asked him, who gives a person a mouth? Who makes him unable to speak, or deaf, or able to see, or blind, or lame, or walk? Is it not I, the Lord? The Lord's claim of sovereignty is not only shocking, but is also accompanied by a declaration of intentionality on his part, which is predicated on a moral pillar of absolute truth, written on stone tablets which Moses presented to the Israelites. God's moral law. Exodus 34:10-15. And he said, behold, I made a covenant before all your people. I will do marvels such as have not been done in all the earth, nor in any nation. And all the people in whose midst you are shall see the work of Jehovah. For it is an awesome thing that I will do with you. Observe that which I commanded you this day. And behold, I will drive out before you the Amorites, and the Canaanites, and the Hittites, and the Perizzites, and the Jebusites. Take heed yourself, lest you make a covenant with the people of the land where you go, lest it be for you a snare, a trap in the midst of you. But you instead shall destroy their altars, break their images, cut down their sacred poles. For you shall worship no other God. For Jehovah, whose name is jealous, is a jealous God, lest you make a covenant with the inhabitants of the land, and they go whoring after their gods, and do sacrifice to them. For you shall worship no other God, but Jehovah, whose name is jealous, and is a jealous God. But, alas, the history of the Jews and man in general is one of whoring about. It seems to show us that man actually demands a sovereign as a solution to the tension between his fear of a lack of certainty and his diminished efficacy of self-governance, and yet rejects the one bona fide self-proclaiming sovereign of creation. As we have noted, the Israelites chose a golden calf idol as sovereign when faced with the uncertain fate of Moses on the mountaintop. In the time of the prophet Samuel, the Israelites loudly clamored for a king, claiming Samuel was too old and their sons too corrupt, but their real motive was revealed as something else. And in spite of being warned by Samuel that the power of a king would take their freedom and oppress them, they insisted. 1 Samuel 8:19-20. But the people refused to obey the voice of Samuel, and they said, "No, we will have a king over us, and we shall be then like all the nations, so that our king may judge us and go out before us and fight our battles for us." Idols of a pagan culture, diabolical political leaders, and phony theories and fallacious ideologies have all been used as proxy sovereigns with powers to construct certainty. But in spite of the power wielded by these man-created sovereigns, uncertainty and abuse of man's self-governance prevailed. Looking back not too far in history, we can observe that Hitler was able to rise to power in large part because the people demanded it. Germany had been decimated by World War I and the post-war provisions of the Versailles Treaty. Oppression, tremendous uncertainty, fear created the ripe emotional atmosphere for a pretender to the throne of sovereign. The people were desperate for certainty and leadership. Thus they didn't see Hitler's true heart, and were slowly indoctrinated and mesmerized by his rhetoric as they lost perspective of the absolute truth. God gave Israel in the time of Samuel, as well as the people in the time of post-war Germany, a king after their own heart, instead of one of God's heart. So what is the heart of Jehovah God? And why does that make him the only true and trustworthy sovereign? Well, before we talk about the heart of God, which is behind his sovereignty, in full disclosure, we need to state that his sovereignty does not include a unilateral certainty. God's sovereignty incorporates both certainty and the full fruition of man's self-governance, inclusive of uncertainty. How does that happen? Well, let's unpack some internals about living under a sovereign reign. To put oneself under the power of a sovereign will require our faith, trust. Why is that relative? Because man at birth is created incomplete. He is separated from his God. His spiritual DNA motivates him, keeps moving him toward his completion, his wholeness with God. And this is a journey which bridges chasms of uncertainty, designed to build man's trust in his sovereign and draw him toward his wholeness with God. To understand this a little better, we should look at the predicate of God's motive for the actualization of his creation, which is inclusive of man's journey of faith. Ephesians 1:4-10. God chose us in Christ before the foundation of the world to be holy and blameless before him in love. Then he destined us for adoption as his children through Jesus Christ, who according to the good pleasure of his will to praise the glorious grace that he freely bestows on us through his beloved Son. In him we have redemption through his blood, the forgiveness of sins, according to the riches of his grace, which he lavishes on us. With all wisdom and insight, he has made known to us the mystery of his will, his intention, according to that good pleasure which he put forth in his Son. It was a plan for the fullness of time to gather all things into himself, things in heaven and on earth. This is such a marvelous expose of God's heart, his intention, his will in creating himself as a sovereign with absolutism over us. His intention was to make us holy, pure, to adopt us into the family of the Trinity as his children, to marry him as a chaste bride to his most beloved Son, to lavish grace upon us that we would flourish, and to give us wisdom and understanding into him, into his intention, into his will, so that we would know through Christ what that will was, what his heart toward us was. A plan to make us whole, a plan to bring us back into the complete wholeness with the entire creation, to be one with him. You see, God's motive to mentor a co-governor of his creation, an intimate bride, chaste and pure, full of wisdom and knowledge, for his Son, Jesus, this was a motive that exposed his heart. That is the heart of the only true sovereign of this universe. And only a sovereign with that kind of a heart is qualified to sanction absolutism. The experience of self-governing in the garden failed because Adam and Eve strayed from the absolutism of God's truth, the rules which he gave them for success at self-governing, his moral law. But all was not lost, because God's sovereignty is built on his heart, who he is. His nature is unconditional love toward us, with benevolent guidance, discipline, true justice, and a desire to have an intimate fellowship with us rather than totalitarian control over us. So, God's heart provided a way, a bridge, for fallen man to journey back to his lofty and noble origin in God's plan. God would not take from man his free will. He desires that relationship with him, not a custodial rule over his creatures. But now man would be challenged every day with a choice to bring his free will under the sovereignty of his Creator and live in harmony with the absolute moral law which supports God's sovereign law, or to whore after other counterfeit sovereigns. It is ironic that the one thing man thought he would have to have in order to successfully govern was certainty, and yet neither false sovereign or the one true sovereign would provide that for him. The difference between the two sovereigns is not the presence or the absence of certainty. It is the journey man would make in his life under that sovereign, and the destination at the end of the path. If man promiscuously philanders about for other sovereigns, his escapades will be an accumulation of disappointments, betrayals, delusions, broken hearts, and failures, spawning a cynical and fatalistic existentialism. False sovereigns cannot deliver on the promise of certainty and thus compromise man's attempt at successful self-governance. But the man who chooses to sojourn on the way of the sovereign Lord will gain a treasure trove of rewards on his journey. He will gain understanding as he lives out the rewards of inner peace, true relational intimacy, joy, wisdom from God, fulfillment and prosperity and relevance in the world, which progressively becomes accessible to him as his life comes into oneness with the absolute moral law of his sovereign through faith and obedience. God gave his nation the moral law that man's life would flourish. If man was totally self-sufficient, he wouldn't have any need for the law. Successful self-governance came with the caveat of abiding in the absolutism of God's moral law. But what about certainty, you say? Where's that in the moral law? It isn't. This now fallen world can no longer produce guaranteed certainty without God taking absolute total control and betraying his own heart in creating man as a chaste, co-governing bride for his Son. No, we are God's love child, and we can love and experience being loved only because God's enduring will to unconditionally love us first is in place. His purpose for us is not to control us. He created us in his image, and his sleepless encouragement of us to accept the uncertainty along our life's paths in exchange for the strength of faith in his heart is paramount. It will reveal the fullness of his heart toward us, that the end of the path will be a destination of supreme fulfillment, an intimate satisfaction of wholeness with him who is love. Man struggles with his pride as he considers the price of accepting God's absolutism. But God is absolute. We cannot change, mitigate, distort, or manipulate his moral law, which is to guide our self-governance. We can only reject it. Humility is required to live in the uncertainty of his sovereign rule. Humility has its great reward. For as we trust him as our sovereign, it opens access to intimacy with him, and thus offers to us his wisdom, his understanding, his peace, his joy. All of that as we move closer to living next to his heart. It is an experiential fact that we will not often understand the why of all of our uncertainty. For this reason, many will not cede their need-to-know right to a sovereign who won't be a king to fight all their battles for them and solve all their problems for them. But God's idea is different. He uses uncertainty to inculcate a trust in him and not the resources of the world, to inculcate a maturity of governance in man. There is, however, an absolute certainty that is our sustaining force during the challenging times of uncertainty. It is his heart. A sovereign who puts his own Son on a wooden cross to die for us so that we can be eternally united with him, can be absolutely trusted to stand right beside us as we journey through the foggy times of insecurity and lack of vision. We can reach for his guiding hand, like reaching for the harness of a seeing eye dog, and be sure he will safely lead us through our blindness. We choose with our free will to agree with his sovereignty and its absolutism, or not. But either way, our choice involves uncertainty. If we choose God's sovereignty, we can live in his peace, joy, and love in the midst of that uncertainty, because his heart is certain and he is within us by his Spirit. If we choose a false sovereign to whom we yielded the freedom of our life, fear, anxiety, loss of vision will tarnish our life, and we will be held captive to the results of our misplaced trust. From an article by Sam Storms, which comments on the tension of living with God's sovereignty and yet experiencing the uncertainty of life's events, which are ordained by God's mysterious intentions, of which we have no knowledge. Quote, "If embracing this tension, this mystery, is offensive to you, I doubt that you will find much comfort in knowing that God is sovereign." So let me take the last moments of this podcast to give you a reason not to be offended by this mystery. The emotion of fear is a God-given gift to us, to warn us to take action against something which threatens our being. When faced with fear, we need to find what action to take, and take it, and then find peace. If we do not find peace, fear begins to increase exponentially. Fear can become a domineering force, resulting in panic, loss of good judgment, a restriction of life, a detriment to our mental, emotional, and physical health, and it will separate us from God's divine provision. Moses and Joshua said, "Fear not, don't be afraid, be strong of good courage. The Lord is with you." And that was when the whole nation of Israel was facing almost certain destruction by the army of the Egyptians closing in on them as they were trapped by the Red Sea. Paul declares that God didn't give us a spirit of fear, but of power, the Spirit of the Lord, even the mind of Christ. Paul wrote that because he understood that fear does not inculcate anything positive unless it leads us to take wise and appropriate action directed by the counsel of the Spirit of God. The Spirit of the Lord is how we deal with fear. It provides for us wisdom, understanding, good advice, knowledge, which direction to go, strength to do it, and a fear of the Lord. And it will lead us to act in consent with God's moral law so that we can successfully self-govern through times of fear. James 1:2-5 says, "Don't run from tests and hardships. As difficult as they are, you will ultimately find joy in them. If you embrace them, your faith will blossom under pressure, and it will teach you true patience as you endure. And true patience brought on by endurance will equip you to complete the long journey of your life, cross the finish line matured, completed, and wanting nothing. If you don't have all the wisdom you need for the journey, then all you have to do is ask God for it, and He will grant it to you, all that you need. He gives you lavishly and never scolds you for asking. Wow, that's an incredible provision. That is the provision of the Spirit of the Lord, which is upon us if we have taken Christ into our life, if He has become our sovereign. Let us admire that our very own salvation was secured through the sovereignty of God, and that we are not our own. Let us stand not in fear, but in awe, awesome fear of the sovereign authority and power of the Lord, thrilled and calmed in these days of great upheaval, because uncertainty will always be with us, but victory belongs to God, and His heart is toward us.
Thanks for being here. Keep in touch with us. We love to hear from you. And if you're a theater enthusiast, you can check out my other podcast channel, Whispers in the Wings, where we converse about theater techniques. Till our next episode on Beneath My Rib, this is Kathleen Ann Thompson, wishing you inspiration and strength on your spiritual journey. You've been listening to Kathleen Ann Thompson on Beneath My Rib. Please visit us at www.bellhurst.com.